This is Washington Nolan's Christmas Watch, a Wyldhaven Christmas novella, written by Lynnette Bonner, narrated by Amy Lilly. Chapter 1. When Zoe awoke on the morning she was to leave for her teaching exam, she couldn't decide if her queasiness was from butterflies or great lurking bats. What she did know was that she wanted to get on the road so they wouldn't be late. She planned to arrive early for the train and the testing venue tomorrow. She hoped punctuality would allow her to relax. Well, relax as much as possible with such a life-changing test looming. She dressed hurriedly in the chill of her room and rushed out to help Ma finish breakfast. But it seemed Ma might just be as nervous as she was because it was obvious Ma had been up for several hours. Pancakes and eggs already sat steaming in the middle of the table, and Ma was hurrying Aiden into his frock coat. "Hustle up now or you'll be late for school." Ma quickly thrust an apple and a paper-wrapped sandwich into each of the 3 lunch pails on the kitchen sideboard. The twins bustled in. Before they could sit at the table, Ma lined them up against the wall next to Aiden. She made sure she had captured the focus of each of the youngsters before she spoke again. "Each of you listen up. Belle is going to be working at the boarding house when you get done with school. I don't want any of you walking that path home alone that time of day. You are to go straight from the school to the boarding house and wait for Belle's shift to conclude. I've already spoken to Mrs. Griffin, and she said you can sit at a table in the dining room to work on your homework while you wait." Sharon nodded. "Yes, Ma. I'll make sure we all get there." Ma gave her shoulder a squeeze. "That's my girl." When Ma turned her back to finish packing the lunches, Shiloh rolled her eyes and stuck her tongue out at Sharon. Zoe suppressed a chuckle and arched one brow at Shiloh. She hoped she would get the message without her having to say a word, but Shiloh only wrinkled her nose and rolled her eyes again. Zoe narrowed a glower at her sibling, but then turned from the confrontation. She didn't have time or energy to spend on dealing with Shiloh's attitude today. Thankfully, everyone seemed ready to go, because she knew Ma wouldn't leave the house until she got the kids off to school and Belle off to work. She ticked through her mental checklist of everything she needed to remember to take with her on the train today. Her glance at the clock on the wall showed that Washington Nolan would be here inside 30 minutes. Thankfully, the storm from earlier this week seemed to have abated. Sunshine currently streamed through the dining room windows to cast golden rectangles across the table and floor. She only hoped there would be no more avalanches. Oh, heavens. She pressed one hand over her middle. "Ma, what if there's an avalanche?" Belle stepped into the room then with her work apron over one arm. She turned and placed both her hands on Zoe's shoulders, giving her a sisterly shake. "There is not going to be an avalanche. Stop it, or you'll make yourself sick." "She's right, Zoe. Come on now, sit down." Ma rushed the twins and Aiden into seats at the table, too. "Everyone, eat your breakfast quickly." Belle took her jacket from the hook by the front door. "Actually, Ma, if they're walking into town with me, we need to go." Ma plunked her hands on her hips. "Aren't you going to eat some breakfast?" Belle shook her head. "No time today. I needed to be at the boarding house first thing since you aren't going to be there to help." Zoe gave Belle a second look. Had there been animosity in that statement? But after only a moment, she gave herself a little headshake. No, Belle had been a bit snippy about her taking the teaching exam at first, but they'd had a good talk, and ever since then, Belle had changed her attitude. Her sister had merely stated a fact, and she appreciated Belle doing extra work so Ma could go on this trip with her. "Well, all right." Ma scooped eggs into the middle of one pancake and rolled it up, tucking one end in. She thrust it at Aiden, then repeated the process for the twins. Shiloh frowned. "But there's no syrup." "It will have to do for today," Ma said. "Get your lunches." She hurried to Belle with one as well, then tugged her into a quick embrace that might have squished the pancake to Belle's blouse if she hadn't thought quickly and thrust it off to one side. "I don't like to see you going without breakfast." Belle lifted the pancake roll, and Zoe could see her tucking away her humor. "Thanks, Ma." "Of course, and thank you for seeing to the young ones for the next couple of days. It's a blessing that I can count on you." Belle nodded. "Of course, I'm happy to help." She strode to Zoe then and pulled her in for a quick one-armed hug. They shared a humorous glance over Ma's insistence that none of her children leave the house without breakfast, and then Belle said, "You will do amazing. Don't be nervous." Zoe laughed apprehensively. "I'm afraid there's not much I can do about that." Belle gave her shoulder a squeeze, then flapped her hands at the kids to get moving. "Just remember how smart you are, and that Mrs. Callahan always said you were one of the brightest pupils in the room." Zoe tilted her look. "She said that about you, too." Holding the door open with one foot so the kids could file out, Belle gave an exaggerated sweep of her hair. "Of course she did." Joining in with Belle's chuckle, Zoe flapped a hand. "Get on with you." "Right, everyone ready?" Belle said to the kids. "Let's go." She pulled the door shut. Zoe blew out a breath, undeniably thankful to have them off for town. She and Ma could share a bite to eat and still have a couple minutes before Wash arrived. "Aiden?" Belle's words drifted in from the yard. Footsteps slapped against the porch boards, and then the door burst open. Aiden flung himself across the room and into Ma's arms. "Don't go, Ma! What if I never see you again?" Ma's lips pressed together, even as tears filled her eyes. She wrapped her arms around Aiden and held him close. There. Nothing's going to happen to me, love. I'm healthy and whole, without any ailment whatsoever, and no one is going to shoot me." They were Aiden's recurring fears, ever since their pa had been shot by an outlaw and died last year after a long bout of illness. "I don't want you to go," Aiden wailed, hugging Ma tighter. Zoe felt a wave of hopelessness crash over her, because when Aiden got into one of these fits, there was no changing his mind. He was stubborn as a mule and twice as dogged. Zoe clenched her fists. Oh, why today of all days? She forced herself to pull in a long, slow breath and then push it out on a measured exhale, but it didn't do anything to quell the storm that had arisen in her middle. Aiden, the little jackanapes. He was probably only trying to get out of school. She didn't even feel guilty for being irritated with him. This was definitely going to make her late. Chapter 2. Washington Nolan dipped a double handful of water from the icy bucket on the back porch and doused it over his hair. He gasped at the frigidity of it. This was good. He could come back to the memory of this moment every time he thought of Zoe Kastain as more than simply his childhood friend during this trip. He'd made a really big mistake last spring and kissed her. And it had been nice. Really nice. But nothing could come of it. He wasn't ready to settle down and start a family, had no idea how he would provide for one. No, he definitely needed to get back to thinking of her as only a friend. As if to solidify the thought, he dashed another handful of water into his face. He couldn't suppress a shiver. That water hadn't gotten any warmer in the past few seconds. His father chuckled from where he stood next to the door, peering into the small mirror while shaving. "Guess it might be time to start bringing the bucket inside nights." He jutted his jaw to one side and stretched his skin tight as the razor scraped over his cheek. Wash fumbled for the piece of toweling. "Seems so, yes." He dried his face and scrubbed at his hair. Pa set down his razor and held out a hand for the towel. Wash handed it over. Using it to wipe the remaining bits of froth from his face, Pa asked, "So they got the trains running again?" "From what I understand. It took them nearly 2 weeks to clear the tracks, though. There were slides in several places." Wash glanced at the pocket watch Pa had given him last Christmas and decided to forego his own shave today. He tucked the watch into his pants pocket and reached for his shirt. He could still hardly believe that Pa had given his great-grandfather's watch to him. It was a beautiful piece with an intricately engraved gold housing. Pa made a tisking noise. "Every modern convenience comes with its own set of problems." "Yes, sir." "So you'll be back in 2 days?" "Yes, sir." Wash worked at his shirt buttons. Pa took up his hat. He stopped on the top step and stared out across the yard for a few minutes, and Wash could tell he was pondering on something he wanted to say. Pa was thoughtful like that. Never uttered a word he didn't think through first. Finally, he settled his hat on his head and offered, "Just remember that a gentleman never leaves hisself behind." He gave a little dip of his chin, as though giving approval to what he'd just said. He strode toward the barn then, leaving Wash to stare after him. He chuckled. Never leaves himself behind? It was such a Pa thing to say. Something that sounded so meaningful and packed a punch, yet didn't really mean anything at all. Wash tucked in his shirt, pushed his hair back, and then settled his Stetson on his head. He grabbed his jacket from the hook inside the door. It was time they got going. He knew how Zoe fretted about being on time for things like this. "Jax, we need to go," he called into the house. "We don't need to leave for half an hour yet," his brother hollered back. "Yeah, but Zoe likes to be early." "Zoe likes to be early," Jackson mimicked as he tromped past. "Fine, let's go." Wash rolled his eyes, hefted his small valise, and trailed his brother to the barn. Jackson had been in a real snit ever since Pa had demanded that he drive Wash, Zoe, and her ma to the train station so he could bring the wagon back home. But thankfully, Jackson knew better than to disobey Pa's orders. The quiet of the frosty morning was broken only by the jangle of the harness bells, the crunch of the wagon wheels over the snow-packed road, and the occasional twitter of a bird. Wash had always loved cold mornings like this, with the sun shining and steam rising from every place the rays touched. Crisp blue sky above, and the snow-dusted winter branches stretching upward as though glorying to be alive. The trip didn't take them long, but the moment Jackson pulled to a stop in the Kastains' yard, it became obvious that something wasn't right. Belle and the twins, bundled in coats and scarves, stood off to one side. Belle kept checking her timepiece, and it was obvious she was feeling impatient. The twins stood with books in one arm and lunch buckets dangling by their sides. They all watched Mrs. Kastain and Zoe, who were on the porch with Aiden. Mrs. Kastain took Aiden by the shoulders and bent to look right into his face. "You have to go to school. Everything is going to be fine. I promise we will be home in just a couple days." Aiden fought through the restraint of her grip and flung himself against her. "No, you can't go. You just can't." Mrs. Kastain rested one hand on Aiden's head and gave Zoe an apologetic look. Zoe gave a little bounce on her toes, the only thing that revealed her impatience with the situation. Washington jumped down from the wagon and strode onto the porch. "Hey now, what's with this fuss?" He squatted down so that he was on Aiden's eye level when Aiden turned from his ma to see who'd spoken. Aiden tilted his head a bit sheepishly. "I don't want Ma to go, or Zoe either. I won't be there to protect him. I'm the man of the house now. I'm supposed to protect him." Wash scratched his jaw. "I see. And what if I told you that I was going to be along to protect him? Would that suffice?" Aiden shook his head. "No, you can't stop a bullet." Large tears brimmed on his lower lids. From the corner of his eye, Washington saw Zoe lift one hand to cover her mouth. A quick glance showed her own tears brimming, and Mrs. Kastain had lifted her gaze to the ceiling of the porch and was blinking rapidly. Washington couldn't imagine what a burden little Aiden had been carrying since the death of his pa. He worked his teeth over one side of his lip. He didn't figure it would do much good to point out to young Aiden that he wouldn't be able to stop a bullet either. This was one situation that he'd best let Mrs. Kastain handle herself. He glanced at her as he stood back up. She dropped one hand against the top of Aiden's blonde mop and gave his head a bit of a ruffle. "Right then, you can come with us and be our protector." From across the yard, Shiloh gasped. "What? If I throw a big conniption and demand to come with you, do I get to skip school too?" "Absolutely not." Mrs. Kastain leveled her with a look that, to Shiloh's credit, she was smart enough not to buck. "You and Sharon get on to school, and please let Mr. Havisham know that Aiden won't be there for a couple of days." Belle nudged the twins. "Let's go, girls." She lifted her hand and waved to her mother and sister. Aiden had already scrambled into the house, and Mrs. Kastain followed him. "I'll need 5 minutes to pack him a few things." Zoe paced the porch, rubbing her temples. "This has made us late. Are we late? What time is it? Are we going to miss the train?" "Zoe!" Wash stepped into her path and bumped her with his hat to stop her pacing. I made sure to get here half an hour early. We aren't going to be late." Zoe rolled her eyes and paced away from him. "What you mean to say is we aren't going to be late so long as nothing else delays us." Washington bit back a grin and decided it was probably the better part of valor not to reply to her comments. "How about we load your bags into the wagon while she gets Aiden ready to go?" "Right." Zoe motioned to the pile just inside the kitchen door. "These are what we're taking." Washington eyed the mound of luggage. Did they think this trip was going to last for a month? How much stuff did one woman need? Again, deciding to exercise discretion, he simply hefted 2 bags and went to the wagon. Quietly, he said to Jackson, "Best you come help me, or we won't get on the road until next week with all the luggage they've got." Jackson pressed his lips together, but he did swing down from the seat and come help him. They were just loading the last piece of baggage into the back of the wagon when Mrs. Kastain stepped from the cabin with Aiden and a small cloth knapsack. She motioned the boy toward the wagon. "Go on. You get in the back there." Grinning like a monkey with a pile of bananas, Aiden scrambled to do as he was told. He sank down next to the luggage, swiping the remnants of tears from his cheeks. Wash couldn't help a little smile as he helped first Zoe's ma and then Zoe up onto the seat next to Jackson. He had a feeling that Aiden had just pulled a good amount of wool over his ma's eyes, but it wasn't his place to say anything. He hauled himself up to the seat, and by the time he sank down next to Zoe, Jackson already had the wagon rolling. Wash tossed him an irritated glance, but with both Zoe and her ma between them, he decided to let a reprimand go. Jackson wouldn't listen to him at any rate. Realizing how crowded they were, Wash tried to scoot as close to the arm of the bench as possible, but it was no use. They were crammed onto the bench like so many peas in a pod. Beside him, Zoe shifted a little. And hang it, if just the feel of her arm brushing his didn't bring to mind that springtime kiss. It had happened just down the road a little way from here. Mrs. Kastain adjusted her skirts, tucking them tighter about her legs. Then she reached over and did the same for Zoe. "Ma!" Zoe brushed her mother's hands back. "I've got it. I'm fine." "Well, we don't want you catching your death of a cold the night before your big exam." "I'm not going to get sick. I'll be fine." "Yes, well, better safe than sorry." Washington decided that he had better save Zoe from her ma's ministrations. He swept a gesture to the sunlight all around them. "Lovely day for a trip, isn't it, Mrs. Kastain?" The woman blinked and glanced around. "Why, yes. I guess it is a beautiful day. I've been running like a hen in cracked corn all morning, and I suppose I haven't noticed until just this moment." "I like cracked corn," Aiden piped up from the back. Something about the muffled quality of the boy's words drew Washington's gaze. Aiden was hanging from the side of the wagon by one arm, leaning out as far as he possibly could and trying to grab handfuls of snow from the drifts piled up along the embankment. Eyes widening, Wash leaned over the back of the seat to grab him just as the wagon hit a good-sized bump. It was a good thing Aiden wore a belt because it was the only thing Wash could catch. He hauled Aiden up like a book he'd grabbed by the spine. "Whoa!" Aiden gasped, arms and legs dangling. "Aiden, do behave." Despite Mrs. Kastain's curt words, Wash did see her give the lad a once-over to make sure he was unharmed before she returned her focus to the fore. Wash lowered Aiden to the safety of the buckboard once more. The boy looked up from beneath his brows. "Thanks." Wash gave him a nod. "I think it might be a good idea if you set your backside down right there and didn't move." Aiden gave a sigh of resignation. "All right." He sank against the pile of luggage and rested his wrists against his knees. And with his mussed hair and tear-tracked face, he looked for all the world like a discarded waif in a New York slum. Wash quickly faced forward before the boy could catch his grin. Zoe gave him an elbow in the ribs. She leaned close and spoke in a low voice. "Don't encourage him. He's already incorrigible enough without prodding." Washington made no reply, but he well remembered the days just after his ma had passed, when he had often felt like he might come apart at the seams for no reason at all. The horses bobbed their heads in the cool winter morning, causing their harness bells to jangle melodically. A tree branch snapped from just behind them. Wash twisted to see that Aiden had broken a branch from a bush they had just passed. But the kid was seated, and what harm was there in letting him have a bit of wood to play with? Next to him on the seat, Zoe seemed to have relaxed a little, and well she might, for they still had plenty of time to make it to the station. After they crossed the Wyldhaven Creek Bridge just ahead, the station would only be 5 minutes farther on. Wash was doing his best to ignore the pleasant feel of Zoe sitting so close to him. He studied the clear cerulean sky. He looked across the field to the lacework of the bare winter branches. He picked at a rough spot on the arm of the wagon's bench seat. None of it served to distract him. Behind them, Aiden methodically snapped little pieces off of the branch he'd grabbed. Wash couldn't help but envy the kid a little. Oh, for the carefree days when he hadn't been thinking about growing up, creating a family, or how to provide for them. Certainly for the days before his nearly every waking thought was of Zoe Kastain and the softness of her lips against his under the trees of the Wyldhaven forest. "Come on now," Jackson spoke softly to the horses. Only then did Wash realize the wagon had come to a stop. Pa's team never had liked crossing this bridge. Maybe it was the loud thumps their hooves made on the old plank boards, or the hollow rumble of the wagon's wheels behind them, or the fact that there were no rails along the sides. Whatever it was, it always took some coaxing to get them across. They bobbed their heads and pawed at the ground, snorting and huffing in protest as Jackson clucked to them and tried to get them moving again. Zoe squeaked out a little sound of misery. She pressed one hand over her stomach, and Wash knew she was worrying again about being late. He leaned close and was just about to give her a bit of a hard time over her anxiety when, from the back of the wagon, Aiden lurched to his feet. "I can get 'em moving, Zoe." The 8-year-old loosed a great feral bellow. "Hi-ya!" He scrambled up to lean over the back of the bench and wash his shoulder on the right, and proceeded to throw a handful of the broken bits of a branch. They pelted the rump of the off-horse. "Let's go!" Despite the fact that Pa's team was a bit skittish, Aiden's yell might not have caused any problems. But his yell not only startled the horses, it also startled a white rabbit that must have been sunning itself on the riverbank. It darted out into the middle of the road right beneath the horses' feet, and then shot off the other side to bound away across the field. Aiden leaned up on his tiptoes and angled a little further so he could keep an eye on the critter. "Golly, did you see that, Ma?" "Aiden, I will not tolerate such language." Mrs. Kastain lunged to snatch a handful of Aiden's hair, just as, with a sound that was more screech than whinny, the bays leaped forward. The nigh horse whinnied and rose up on its back legs, causing the off one to shy away from it. The wagon skated on the snow. "Whoa!" Jackson yelled. But it was too late. The horses had surged too close to the edge of the bridge. One wheel slipped off the side. The wagon was going over. Chapter 3. "Aiden!" Zoe screamed, clutching at the bench seat as the wagon tipped precariously. The rear right wheel slipped off the bridge, and Zoe could hear the axle scraping along the lip as the wagon slowly swung farther over the edge. Aiden, who had been flung to the side when the wagon tipped, hung precariously from the arm of their bench with the icy waters of Wyldhaven Creek waiting below. The wagon slid another few inches. Zoe lurched across Wash to grab Aiden, but Wash beat her to it. "I've got you." He leaned as far down as he could to grab Aiden's belt again. Zoe leaned farther, trying to see over his shoulder. "Do you have him?" A loud crack shot through the morning as the arm of the seat broke away. Extended and off balance as he was, and with Aiden's weight hanging from his arms, Wash lost the battle with gravity. "No!" Zoe grasped his jacket and tried to haul them back, but their combined weight was too much for her. All three of them tumbled over the side. The ice-cold, black waters of Wyldhaven Creek enveloped her. The creek was so cold that for a moment she wouldn't have been able to breathe even if she hadn't been underwater. So dark, She turned, twisted, twirled, trying to see which way was up. The current tugged at her, and panic pulsed through her. She needed air. A hand grabbed her, propelled her toward the surface. It was Wash. With him beside her, she gulped a great breath of sweet oxygen. Thankfully, though the water was moving at a good clip, it wasn't much more than waist-deep here. She found her footing, and none too soon, for Wash was pushing her upstream. "Move! That way!" The wagon! Was it about to fall on them? "Go, Zoe!" He shoved her harder, and she blindly surged against the current. What about Ma and Jackson? What had happened to them? And Aiden? Aiden! Zoe stopped and spun, searching the water. "He's right here." Wash's voice emerged gritty and grim. And sure enough, with Wash gripping a firm handful of the boy's jacket collar, Aiden thrashed right next to her. "Oh!" She grabbed him and tugged him close, helping him get to his feet. From above them, there came a loud scraping sound. "Ha! Ha!" Jackson stood, slapping the reins against the horse's rumps and yelling at the top of his voice. Ma sat wide-eyed, clutching the seat. Zoe immediately saw Jackson's plan. If he could just get the wagon across the bridge, the wheel that was hanging over the edge would hit the embankment and right itself. But with each passing moment, the wagon slipped a little farther over the edge. "Jesus, please!" Zoe didn't have time for more of a prayer than that before the horses gave one last valiant effort, and then the wagon's wheel connected with solid ground on the north side of the creek. The wagon trundled a few more feet to the middle of the road. "Whoa!" Jackson pulled to a stop and collapsed into the seat. Snatching his hat from his head, he swiped his forehead with his arm and looked back at them. "Good job," Wash said. Jackson nodded. Relief coursing through her. Zoe huddled into the curl of her arms. "Are you okay?" Wash placed one hand at her back and peered into her face. How warm his hand felt. It struck Zoe as odd, drenched to the skin as they both were. She nodded. "I'm fine." But they all needed to get out of this water. They were closer to the southern embankment, so they would have to climb out there and then cross the bridge to get back to the wagon. "Can you take him?" She nudged Aiden toward Wash. "Happy to." With an aggravated press of his lips, Wash took her brother by his collar and his belt. He flung the boy onto the snowy embankment without much ceremony. Aiden gasped and floundered in the snow to gain his feet. He wrapped his arms around himself and shivered uncontrollably. "What'd you do that for?" Zoe bit back a grin. Washington had obviously lost much of the sympathy she'd seen in his eyes for Aiden back on the porch a bit ago. Ignoring Aiden, Wash took her by the arm, and together they slogged their way toward the embankment. The cold hit her like a slap as they reached the shallows. Her dress clung to her like a sausage casing, and the water had swept away most of her hairpins because her hair cascaded across her shoulders. She clenched her teeth against the impulse to whimper. That wouldn't be proper. On the embankment, Aiden had no such compunctions. "I'm freezing. I want to go to school." Zoe was suddenly too angry to care about propriety. "Aiden William Kastain, if you had gone to school this morning like you were supposed to, none of this would have happened. When will you learn to think before you act?" She slogged another couple of steps closer to the bank. Ma rushed toward them across the bridge. "Zoe, don't speak to your brother in such a manner." Aiden thrust his chin into the air. His reply emerged as a wail. "Weren't my fault. How was I to know those horses were spookier than ghosts?" Ma reached Aiden and wrapped her arms about his shoulders. "Come on, darling. We have to get you out of these wet things." Zoe gritted her teeth. Washington clambered up onto the embankment and reached down to haul Zoe out as well. With her feet planted firmly on solid ground again, Zoe felt panic welling up inside her. "What time is it?" Everything shook, including her chin when she said, "We're going to be late for the train." Tears blurred her vision. "Nonsense." Wash settled his hand to her back once more and nudged her toward the bridge. "The train station is only 5 minutes from here, and it'll be faster to go there than to try to get back to your place anyhow." He swept a hand for her to precede him to the wagon. Ma was already hustling Aiden into the wagon bed and climbing in after him. Thankfully, none of the bags seemed to have fallen out. I was even able to save my hat. He lifted it as though she might need to see it in proof. His lips lifted wryly. Once we check into our seats, we'll find a berth where we can all get changed. I'm cold. Aiden's whine caused Zoe's jaw to jut to one side. She didn't dare speak to him again, or she would surely be ashamed of what she said later on. Ma's eyes sparked at her with frustration, but she didn't reprimand, only tugged Aiden close to her side. Here, huddle next to me for warmth. Washington mumbled something under his breath, but then he seemed to gather himself in hand. He held one hand to help Zoe into the back of the wagon, at the same time as he motioned Ma to look in the corner of the buckboard with the other. There are a couple horse blankets there. We should all try to stay as warm as possible between here and the station. Jackson looked back from his place on the driver's seat. Are we still going to the station? Wash smiled at her. Of course we are. We aren't going to let a little thing like a winter dip in Wyldhaven Creek stop Zoe from becoming a teacher. Just think of the story she's going to have to tell in the future. Zoe rolled her eyes at him and reached for one of the blankets. Jackson set the team into a fast trot, and Zoe almost gasped at the shock of the cold wind against her wet clothes. She scrambled to sit next to Ma and Aiden, feeling Wash do the same. They all four huddled against the front wall of the wagon bed, trying to avoid as much of the wind as possible. Ma and Aiden shared one of the blankets, and she and Wash shared the other. And despite the fact that she had daydreamed many a time about being this close to Wash again, she couldn't seem to do anything but try to concentrate on warm thoughts. That, and push away her worry over whether they would make it to the station on time. Chapter 4. Zoe followed Ma into the train station with Aiden's hand clasped firmly in her own. Her wet boots squeaked across the tiles, and she heard Wash shuffling along behind her. She glanced over her shoulder. The poor man was not only still soaking wet, but burdened down with their plethora of bags. He even had one tucked beneath his arm. She had offered to help, but he'd insisted he'd be fine, and really, with her skirts as wet as they were, she needed one hand to hold them so she could walk. The beauty of the station's architecture had always fascinated her. With the decorative plaster dome overhead and the hammered bronze accents, she could stand and study the art for hours. But today, the moment they stepped inside, conversations all around them ceased. A woman to her right gasped and covered her mouth with one hand as she swept them with a horrified look. After that, Zoe only had the gumption to study the small space directly in front of her feet, never mind the grand ceiling. She heaved at her skirt to take a few more steps. What a sight they must be, leaving a trail of drips in their wake and hair all astraggle. Even Ma, who was the most presentable of them all, had a large wet splotch on her dress from where Aiden had sat on her lap between the creek and here. As they followed Ma across the room, Aiden tugged for the release of his hand, but Zoe tightened her grip. Let me go! Zoe bent and whispered fiercely, Aiden Kastain, you've made enough trouble today. Stop. You will hold my hand until we get on the train, and that's final. His shoulders slumped, but at least he quit fighting her. Zoe stood behind Ma, who handed their tickets to the man behind the counter. He was speaking to his colleague in the next booth when they stepped to his window. He took the papers methodically and looked them over. Then he glanced up. His eyes widened, and he actually leaned to see around Ma. His curiosity focused first on Wash and then on her and Aiden. Ma cleared her throat sharply. I need to add one ticket for my son. She motioned to Aiden. After taking Ma's payment, the attendant handed back their paperwork. Give this to the official in car 7, but... He paused, as though hesitant to offend her with his next words. Would you like to pay an extra $1 to have a private berth? Zoe's eyes shut. Of course, a private berth would cost extra. Where were they going to find a dry place to change? Because she knew Ma didn't have a spare $1. They'd counted their money last night and had only enough for the train fare, the boarding house rooms in Seattle, one for their family and one for Wash, and a bit of food along the way. Zoe wasn't even certain where Ma had come up with the money for Aiden's fare. Ma tossed her a fretful glance. Behind Zoe, cases clunked to the floor, and Wash stepped to the counter. "Yes, we would." He thrust his hand into his inner coat pocket. His jacket was so wet that his hand got stuck as he tried to extract it. With a grunt, he gave it a yank and withdrew a wallet. He wrenched it open and slapped a dollar bill onto the counter in front of the attendant. Without a word, the man slid the bill from the counter and handed Wash a key on a placard. "Give this to the steward in car 7, and he'll show you the way." A sympathetic smile and another sweeping glance accompanied the instructions. Wash gave the man a curt nod and then set to loading himself down with all their bags again. Zoe and Ma waited without a word until he had all the luggage in hand. Then Ma led the way to car 7. This official was just as curious about their appearance and less polite about it. He smirked as Ma handed over their papers and the key to the berth, but didn't move. After a prolonged scrutiny, he broke into a chuckle. "Had a little trouble on the way here, did we?" "Astute observation," Wash groused dryly. Apparently realizing his error in judgment, the attendant turned and hurried down the aisle. "Right this way. I'm sure you'll be pleased that you spent the extra $3 for our largest berth." Zoe exchanged a look with Ma. Wash had only paid $1, but the moment the attendant pushed the door of their compartment open and she saw how small the interior was, she thanked Jesus for the Christmas generosity of the first man in the station. Even this more expensive berth would be a bit cramped with all of them in it, but blessed heavenly mercies, against the outer wall of the berth stood a small coal-burning stove. The remainder of the compartment consisted of 2 padded benches that faced each other and a tiny coat closet with 2 hangers. "Thank you," Wash said as the attendant left to return to his post. His tone was contrite, as though he realized he'd been a bit short with the man. Ma led the way into the room, and Wash stacked all their bags in a pile in the little closet, then stepped back. "I'll wait out here till you all are situated." He closed the door as he left. "Aiden, quickly now." Ma hurried to dress Aiden in dry clothes, while Zoe huddled near the stove. As soon as she was done, Ma tossed Aiden's wet clothes over the stovepipe and then stepped into the hall with him, leaving the room to Zoe. She tried to hurry so Wash wouldn't be stuck in his wet clothes any longer than necessary, but soaked as she was, everything was heavy and clingy. She felt like a caterpillar shedding its skin as she peeled off the traveling dress and petticoats. When she slipped into her dry, everyday dress, nothing had ever felt quite so good. She took one of the hangers from the closet and hung her clothes from the berth's curtain rod. The weight of the wet dress bowed the rod in the middle, but it seemed to be holding okay. Satisfied to let her hair dry a little before she did it up, Zoe hurried out to give Wash the space. Wash didn't take long to change, and soon they were all seated on the room's 2 facing padded benches, Ma and Aiden on one bench and Zoe and Wash on the other. Wash had followed her example and used the other hanger to hang his jacket, shirt, and pants from the rod. The wooden bar bowed low in the middle, but that would place their clothes closer to the heat and hopefully help them dry quicker. Zoe touched her temple and tried to think. She'd planned to use this time on the train to look over some geographical terms, but that would mean pulling her satchel from the bottom of the closet, and she had to work up the gumption to move away from the warmth of the stove. "What time is it?" she asked. Wash stretched out one leg and reached into his pocket. He withdrew a gold pocket watch and flipped it open. But he didn't offer the time, only stared at the timepiece with his jaw working back and forth. "What's the matter? Is something wrong?" With a sigh, Wash clicked the cover shut and thrust the watch back into his pocket. Zoe was puzzled. "Aren't you going to tell me the time?" "Can't," he said. "Watch must have got wet during our little swim. It's not working." Oh, no. Zoe would have liked to give Aiden a good thrashing right about then. If Pa were here, he would do it. Was it very expensive? They would have to replace the piece, or give Wash payment for its ruin at the very least. Wash shrugged. "Not exactly sure. It was my great-grandfather's watch." "Oh, Wash." Zoe laid a hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry." Wash glanced down at her hand, and Zoe quickly snatched it back into her lap. What had she been thinking to touch him like that? And in front of Ma, no less. She could tell by the narrowed scrutiny Ma was even at this very moment giving her that she would have some explaining to do later for the lapse in propriety. But Aiden had ruined Wash's family heirloom. They would definitely have to do something about fixing it. She considered their meager funds. Maybe she could give up some meals in order to have money to pay for the repairs. After that, none of them said a word. They simply sat, like refugees who'd recently escaped a war zone. Not even Aiden made a sound, and he normally chattered worse than a squirrel. Across the room, the curtain rod snapped. Zoe's clothes splattered into a heap next to Wash's as the two ends of the rod pinged from the ceiling to rattle on the floor of the compartment. None of them even flinched. They all simply stared. Then Zoe glanced sideways. Why would a $3 train berth have such weak curtain rods? Couldn't the designers foresee that people might need to use it to hang things on? Wash quirked one eyebrow, gaze fixed on the pile of steaming clothes. There is a closet. Zoe conceded. Right. I suppose that they would expect things to be hung in there. They likely couldn't foresee that 3 travelers would arrive soaking wet and need to hang their things by the stove, especially not a dress that weighs a gazillion pounds when wet. I don't suppose they could have anticipated that. She sighed. Now what? Wash burst out laughing. Ma followed suit. And then they were all laughing, long and deep, until they each had tears streaming down their faces. Chapter 5. Thankfully, after their terrible morning, the rest of the trip to Seattle was uneventful. Wash was never happier to see the first leg of a trip coming to a close. After the incident with the curtain rod, Zoe had fretted that they might have to pay for it, but the conductor had apologized profusely, saying it must have been faulty to begin with. And when Mrs. Kastain had offered him money, he'd waved her away, much to her relief. Neither Zoe nor her ma had said anything, but Wash had a feeling their funds were running tight on this trip. He was glad they'd asked him to come along. Hopefully he could pay for a few things that would ease their purse strings a mite. After the conductor's reassurance, they had all managed to rest a little, and Zoe had even settled down enough to do a little studying. And if he'd done a little studying of his own, watching her while she concentrated on her books, well then, no one seemed to have noticed. But now, as he followed her down the train aisle toward the exit with her ma and Aiden trailing, a knot cinched tight in his stomach. Just the few glimpses that he'd seen out the window so far showed so much commotion and chaos. His every protective instinct screamed at him not to let them off the train. He clenched his teeth and reminded himself to breathe. The Lord would watch over them. After all, he had called Zoe to teach, and in order to do that, she had to take this test. In front of him, Zoe adjusted her grip on the valise that she'd insisted he let her carry. She navigated past a table and chairs in the main part of the lavish Pullman car and didn't even comment on the beautiful furnishings, which was so unlike her. If she weren't so nervous about her test, she would be thrilled beyond containment by this moment. Realizing the exit lay just ahead, Wash touched her shoulder. Let me go first. She moved to one side, and he squeezed past her, stepped down to the platform, and turned to help her descend. As she placed her small hand within his and settled onto the platform beside him, she took in the area with a sweep of her blue eyes, and her expression brightened in excitement. Of course, she would be excited by all the activity. He, on the other hand, felt like he might turn sick. If anything happened to this family, he'd never be able to forgive himself. He'd best keep a close eye on Aiden so he didn't get lost in the bustle. He reached to help Mrs. Kastain from the car, but his focus was more on their surroundings. Everywhere he looked, chaos reigned. How would he ever find their boarding house in a city this big, much less the testing venue Zoe needed to get to in the morning? Isn't this amazing? Zoe clasped her hands beneath her chin, eyes sparkling. That might be one way of putting it, but it wouldn't be his first choice. Loud, bawdy, not a place for a lady, especially not one as naive and gentle of heart as Zoe Kastain. All those were more apt descriptions of this place. Here an old woman hawked apples, but beside her a woman of another type sauntered through the crowd, with everything she offered on full display. "Oh, heavens!" Mrs. Kastain gasped. Wash jerked his focus to where a young boy ran through the crowd yelling at the top of his voice about newspapers for sale, then onto a group of Chinese businessmen who trotted by discussing something seemingly very important at the top of their lungs. Wash gathered their bags, and thankfully, with Aiden carrying his knapsack and one other small bag, and Mrs. Kastain and Zoe each carrying one also, the task was easily accomplished. He only had to carry 2 bags in each hand. "Let's go this way." He nudged Zoe in a direction that seemed to have the least activity. They could pause in a moment and gather themselves to figure out where they needed to go. "Get out of here, you scurvy mutt!" Just ahead, a butcher in a bloody apron surged from a storefront swinging a broom. A yelp drew Wash's gaze to the dog receiving the brunt of the man's anger. It skulked away from the butcher shop, so skinny its ribs could be counted. With one last muttered threat, the butcher returned inside. That poor dog. Zoe bent to get a better look. No. The last thing they needed was for Zoe's compassion to have them feeding every stray animal in the city. "Zoe, don't touch it," Mrs. Kastain cautioned. "Ma, it's starving, and with all these people around, how could everyone be so cruel? We have to help it." Wash pulled in a lungful of the rank air. "Zoe, we can't—" Her pleading eyes cut him off mid-reprimand. He swallowed. How had her pa ever said no to her? Thankfully, her ma seemed to be on his side. She nudged Zoe in the back. "We can't help it right now, Zoe. We need to get you to the boarding house so you can get a good night's rest." "But, Ma, we can't just leave it here. Look at the poor thing." The dog seemed to realize she was speaking about it. It scooted a little closer and settled to its bony haunches, ears pricked hopefully. Wash pressed his lips together. The dog did have soulful eyes that were hard to ignore. It was white with black spotches and dark eyes. One of its ears flopped to the side, while the other remained at attention. Tugging Aiden behind her, Mrs. Kastain prodded Zoe again. "It's a full-grown dog, Zoe. It has survived this long, it will be fine." Zoe's shoulders slumped a little. "Are there any biscuits left in the lunch pail?" "I ate the last one." Aiden scuffed his toe at the boardwalk, looking sorry about his revelation. Oh, hang it all, this was no good. "Over here." Wash herded the little family into a clear space next to the wall of the brick building. He set the bags at their feet and gave Aiden a firm look. "Watch the bags and the ladies. I'll be right back." Aiden straightened a little, and Wash was glad to see he seemed to be taking his order seriously. He stepped through the door, and a bell dinged above his head. The man looked up, and a large smile spread across his face. "What can I do for you?" He still wore the blood-smeared apron, and the store smelled so rank that Wash wondered if he'd be doing the dog any favors by buying it a bone in here. He glanced the length of the table, which had cut after cut of meat laid on it out in the open, some of them with flies crawling across them. Wash swallowed. "I need a beef stew bone, a fresh one." The man tilted his head. "I have a good meaty one, but fresh costs extra." "Just give it to me." Wash dug out his wallet and plucked the requested amount onto the counter, while the butcher wrapped the large bone in brown paper. He couldn't believe he'd just paid good money for a bone for a dog, meaty or not. But only a moment later, when he gave the dog the bone and it trotted off, tail wagging, Zoe stepped to the side and clasped his arm in gratitude. She looked up at him, eyes soft with appreciation. "Thank you." And as Washington looked down at her, he knew he hadn't purchased that bone for the dog. Not at all for the dog. Susan Kastain studied the way Zoe clutched Wash's arm, and the way Wash looked at Zoe, and her stomach gave a slow turn. She remembered the way Zoe's hand had fallen on Washington's arm so naturally back in the train car. A sigh slipped free. She was not ready to lose her baby to a man, even if he was as good a man as Washington Nolan. And it was clear from the way they looked at one another that their attraction was mutual. Why had she thought it a good idea to bring Wash along on this trip? She hefted her valise and motioned for Aiden to do the same. "We'd best get a move on if we are to find this boarding house. The owner telegraphed instructions for us to arrive before 6 if we expect to eat the meal provided with the room. She doesn't serve after that." In truth, they had plenty of time before that deadline, but maybe if they were moving, Zoe and Wash would put a little space between themselves. As she'd hoped, they separated and took up their part of the luggage. Susan tugged the paper she'd written notes on from the hem of her sleeve. "It says we need to find Yesler Way." A man approaching must have overheard her comment, for he paused before her and pointed. "You'll find Yesler's just that-a-way." Susan dipped her knees. "Much obliged to you." He tipped his hat, but didn't step out of her path. "Yes'm." His gaze swept over her, and Susan wasn't so old that she'd forgotten what it was like to have a man appreciate her in such a way. She felt her face heat. "My children and I thank you." He glanced past her then, and a smile nudged at his lips. He moved to the side and tipped his hat once more. "All the best to you and your family, ma'am." Indeed, in this instance, the mention of her progeny had given her the desired consequences. But what about the day when she might be interested in a man? None would likely want a widow with 5 intractable children. On the heels of the thought, guilt swept in. William wasn't even gone a year yet. She certainly oughtn't be having thoughts about finding another husband. "Ma, everything all right?" Zoe asked. Susan blinked back to the present. "Yes, fine." Wash strode out in the lead, and they all fell in behind him. Thankfully, Aiden must have been worn out by his dip in the cold creek and the long day, because he trailed along beside her without his usual boisterous chatter and exploratory side trips. She didn't think her patience had enough foundation to keep chasing him down after the day they'd had. The city was loud, with taxi carriages in nearly every shape and size, and hills steep enough to make her catch her breath. It was a good thing it rarely snowed this close to the ocean, for if a carriage had to take such a road in snow or ice, they would likely skate straight past the wharves and right into the bay itself. But the view. She paused at the top of one hill to take in the scene. Sunlight glinted in a long swath across the surface of the Prussian blue Pacific, and out a little way, several forested islands dotted the landscape. Despite the bustle and noise, for such a view, she could happily live here. She hurried to catch up to the children, turning her focus to the architecture. Many of the buildings in the heart of the city were russet brick or stone structures. Even in Wyldhaven, they'd heard about the fire that took out most of this district a few years back. Residents had decided to reconstruct with safer materials, it seemed. Wash found their boarding house only a few minutes later, and they were directed to their rooms on the second floor. Susan was glad when they decided they would meet in 30 minutes to go down for dinner. She needed a moment to simply sit and rest. They left Wash in his room and entered their own. Susan was relieved to see that the chamber was comfortably furnished and clean. It had a small window overlooking the street below, and there was even a vanity and a mirror in one corner. Zoe plunked onto one of the room's 2 narrow beds and rubbed her temples. "I'm exhausted." Susan unwound her scarf. "We all are." She knew Zoe would be up half the night studying, and she worried about how little sleep Zoe had been getting in recent months, what with all the work she'd been doing to help Mr. Havisham with the Wyldhaven school. Not to mention that soaking in the creek this morning. "Are you warm enough?" "Yes, Ma." "Not feeling at all sick, are you?" Even as she asked Zoe the question, she placed a hand to Aiden's forehead. "No, Ma, I'm fine." Thankfully, Aiden's temperature felt normal. "We should all try to get a little nap before dinner." "Can't." Zoe brushed away her comment. "I have to find a watchmaker." Susan paused in mid-removal of her coat. A what? A watchmaker. Wash's watch stopped working because of the water. She made a face in Aiden's direction. So I want to see if it can be repaired as a Christmas present. He's done so much for me, especially since Pa's passing, that it's really the least I can do. Susan hung her coat on the knob of the brass headboard and paced to the window. She hadn't missed the way Zoe's cheeks pinked a little. She pressed her hands together. I realize we will have to repay him eventually, but we don't have the money for it on this trip. Oh, I already had that figured out. I'll just give up meals. Unless, of course, the cost of repairs will be more than that. I need to find a watchmaker and ask about prices. I'll go down to the desk right now while Wash is resting. But Zoe, Susan spun from the window. The door clicked shut and Susan sighed. When Zoe was determined to do something, there really was no stopping her. But she couldn't simply skip all her meals on this trip. She glanced down to find Aiden looking up at her. He held up a dime. Belle gave me this to buy some candy, but Zoe can have it to help fix the watch. Large tears pooled in his big blue eyes. Susan tugged him close to her side and lifted her eyes to the ceiling as she rubbed his back. Most days she felt overwhelmed by parenting 5 children all alone, but moments like this kept her going. Chapter 6. Zoe poked her head out of their boarding house room door and checked the hallway to make sure Washington wasn't in sight. Seeing that the way was clear, she quickly went down to the front desk and asked the woman there if she knew of a nearby watchmaker. Oh, yes. There's one not 2 blocks from here. If you hurry, you can catch him before he closes for the evening. Zoe glanced at the clock behind the desk. If it was only 2 blocks, she should have time to get there and back before dinner. She should run up and tell Ma, but she would only say not to go. And tomorrow would be consumed with testing. She wouldn't have time to do much then. Besides, she'd be back before Ma even had time to worry. She walked all over the place in Wyldhaven without an escort. She'd be fine. She thanked the woman and, with instructions in hand, set out to walk to the store. She gloried in the peach and aqua sunset shot through with gold as she took a street perpendicular to the water. My, but this was a beautiful city. Maybe she would come back here to teach someday. The shop was easy to find, and the bell above the door jangled as she entered. A nice-looking older man stood from where he'd been bent over the counter. He had sandy curls that were fading to silver in a few places, and the most appealing color of brown eyes she'd ever seen. They fell somewhere between chocolate and caramel. She noticed because one of his eyes was magnified very large by a pair of spectacles that had 3 round lenses lowered over the main rectangular one. What an interesting contraption. The man removed them and offered a smile. Welcome to Harrow's Timepieces and Repairs. How may I help you? Fascinating. Zoe made the exclamation before she thought better of it, and then figured she ought to explain. I've never seen a pair of eyeglasses like that before. The man angled them so she could get a better look. Each of these lenses gives magnification. If I slide down 2, magnification is increased, and again with this 3rd one. He looked at the door expectantly. Is someone accompanying you? Zoe waved a hand. Oh, no, I walked down alone. The man set the spectacles on a soft cloth that had a lot of little gears and tiny brass parts on it. I see. Are you in the city alone? Zoe chuckled, a little uneasy over his probing questions, but also curious. What tells you I'm not from around here? The watchmaker shrugged. Any woman from Seattle would know how dangerous the streets are in the day, much less with dark coming on. Oh. Zoe turned to check the quickly falling dusk outside. I'm in town to take the teaching exam tomorrow, and our boarding house is only 2 blocks from here. My question shouldn't take long, and I'm sure I'll be fine on the way back. The man carefully folded the corners of the piece of material on the counter inward to cover the small parts. My name is Elijah Harrow. Zoe dipped a small curtsy. I'm Zoe Kastain. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Harrow. He smiled. Likewise. Now, what can I do for you? He folded his hands on the counter and gave her his full attention. Well, since I'm in a bit of a hurry to get back to the boarding house, I won't tell you the whole story. But I have a friend, and suffice it to say, his great-grandfather's pocket watch took a dip in a creek this morning, and now it stopped working." Mr. Harrow's eyes sparkled. "It's a little cold for a dip in a creek." "Oh my, yes, it was." Zoe shivered just thinking about it. "It was my little brother's fault, you see, but I said I wasn't going to tell you the whole story. Anyhow, I'm just wondering if you think you can fix it. The watch means a lot to my friend." Mr. Harrow tilted his head. "It really depends on the watch. Do you have it with you?" Zoe's shoulders slumped. "No. I was hoping you might have an idea of the cost so I could know if we could afford to get it fixed. Then if we can, I'll get the watch and bring it to you. I'm hoping to give it back to him as a Christmas surprise." "I see." The man smoothed his hands over the counter. "Are your mother and father at the boarding house?" An ache kicked to life in Zoe's chest. "My ma is. In fact, I need to hurry back so she doesn't worry since I didn't tell her I was leaving. But my pa, he passed on last spring." "I'm very sorry to hear that. I lost my own wife not long ago." The man's expression softened with understanding. Her ache grew. "I'm sure you miss her." He nodded. "Very much." "Do you ever try to remember what life was like before? My sister is a painter, you see, and she's amazingly talented, if I do say so. She painted a picture of our family in a wagon on the way to town. She captured Pa's smile to perfection. But try as I might, I can't seem to recall his laugh or his voice." Zoe batted a hand through the air. "Sorry, I'm rambling again." Mr. Harrow smiled, if it was a bit sadly. "I understand your wish. It would be lovely to hear my wife's voice even once more." Zoe didn't want to linger in melancholy thoughts the night before her big test. Past experience had proven that she didn't sleep well when she let herself wallow in too much misery. "So you can't give me a price until you see the watch, is that right?" At his nod, she continued, "I understand. I'll try to bring it by tomorrow, but I have a test, so I'm not certain how long that'll take." "2 bits." Zoe blinked at the man. He bobbed his head. "If you bring me the watch, I'll do my best to fix it for 2 bits." "Oh, you've no idea how happy that makes me." Zoe couldn't suppress a little hop. "Yes, I'll get the watch here tomorrow, somehow." He smiled and reached for his jacket, which hung on a coat tree behind the counter. "Now, how about you let me walk you back to the boarding house so your mother knows you're safe?" "Oh, I don't want to put you to any trouble." "Nonsense." He slid his arms into his sleeves. "It's not anything I wouldn't do for any other paying customer."
"Well, if you're certain, I'll say thank you in advance so I don't forget."
He smiled and held the door open for her, then locked it behind them. "I'm certain a lovely young lady like you would not forget." Zoe was thankful to feel her grief lifting. It came in waves, and sometimes she wasn't expecting the staying power of it. Today, it seemed like she might be able to get past it.
"I do try to mind my manners, but sometimes I just get so excited about one thing or another that I forget where I am."
She blushed.
"Like just now, I can't imagine what made me blather all this to you."
Mr. Harrow clasped his hands behind his back as they trudged up the hill. "It's not a problem."
"Oh, Zoe, there you are."
Ma rushed down to them with Aiden's hand clasped firmly in hers. She was bundled up in her long coat with a wool cap on her head, as was Aiden. The sight reminded Zoe how chilly it was. She'd left her own coat in their room. She wrapped her arms around herself as she and Mr. Harrow paused on the sidewalk.
"You gave me such a fright."
Ma leaned to enfold Zoe in a relieved embrace.
"This is the city, not Wyldhaven. You can't go running off on your own without—"
Ma's gaze settled on Mr. Harrow. Ma's breath puffed a little cloud before her, and Mr. Harrow remained still, with his hands still clasped behind his back. But there was a little crinkle at the corner of each eye, and his gaze swept from Ma's cap to her boots and back again. Zoe motioned to the man.
"Ma, this is the watchmaker, Mr. Harrow, and you'll never believe the good news."
Susan Kastain. Ma extended her hand. "Thank you for escorting her back." Mr. Harrow bowed over Ma's hand, but he never took his eyes off her face. Elijah Harrow. And your daughter is enchanting. It was my pleasure, one that has now been doubled." Zoe glanced back and forth between the two adults. They were still looking at one another, and Mr. Harrow hadn't released Ma's hand. And, of all things, Zoe squinted to see better in the fading light. Was Ma blushing? Zoe shuffled her feet. "Mr. Harrow has offered to fix Wash's watch for 2 bits, Ma." "Is that so?" Ma extracted her hand from Mr. Harrow's and nudged Aiden forward. "This is my son, Aiden. Aiden, meet Mr. Harrow."
"Hiya."
Aiden stretched out his hand.
"Do you have kids that I can play with?"
Settling a restraining hand on Aiden's shoulder, Ma said, "Aiden, that is not an appropriate question upon a first meeting." But Mr. Harrow didn't seem offended. He merely chuckled as he bent to shake Aiden's hand and meet him at eye level. "I'm afraid I don't. My wife passed away, and we never had any children." For some reason, the man tossed Ma a glance as he said the words. Zoe reached to take Ma's arm and turn her back toward the boarding house. It brought the ache in her heart roaring back at full speed to see Ma looking at another man the way she used to look at Pa.
"Thank you, Mr. Harrow, again for walking me this far."
She meant the words as a dismissal. But the man continued doggedly in their wake. "I'll just see you all back, if you don't mind."
"Of course, and thank you."
Ma spoke before Zoe could think how to politely dismiss him. But thankfully, the door of the boarding house lay just ahead. They paused at the entrance. Mr. Harrow gave a quiet bow and, in that quiet, steady voice of his, said, "See you on the morrow, then." But for some reason, his attention was yet again fixed on Ma and not on her. Ma nodded and fiddled with her scarf.
"Yes, I'll bring the timepiece myself. Say, mid-morning?"
"I'll look forward to it." Mr. Harrow took his leave without much more conversation other than to say, "Until tomorrow." And for the fact that she'd liked him so much on first meeting him, Zoe was unaccountably relieved to see the man walking away. She tugged on Ma's arm.
"Quick, let's get back to our room before Wash sees us."
She snuck up the back stairs and checked the hallway, then darted to their room and held the door for Ma and Aiden. Safely back inside, she plunked down onto her bed. She pushed thoughts of Mr. Harrow from her mind. What she'd thought she'd seen was probably nothing. She needed to concentrate on what to do next. She had to figure out a way to get Wash's watch without his knowing. She angled a glance to where Aiden sat slumped on the other bed, legs swinging in boredom. The little shyster had helped damage the watch. The least he could do would be to help fix it.
"Aiden, I need your help."
Zoe leaned back on her elbows. Aiden sat up.
"What you need?"
"You are going to help me steal Wash's watch."
Ma gasped. "Zoe Elaine Kastain, whatever are you speaking of? Think what you're teaching Aiden."
Zoe conceded with a chuckle.
"Okay, borrow it."
She quirked an eyebrow at Aiden to make sure he got the point. Leaping from the bed, he rubbed his hands in glee.
"Oh, this is going to be fun."
Zoe rolled her eyes. If they could pull this off without raising Wash's suspicions, it would be a miracle. Aiden bounced on his toes.
"How are we going to do it?" "At dinner time, I need you to ask to see his watch, and then you must distract him so that I can tuck it away."
"Zoe," Ma exhaled, "all of this seems rather clandestine. Wouldn't it simply be better to tell Washington what you'd like to do for him?" Zoe shook her head.
"Ma, it's for a Christmas present."
She pegged her little brother with a look.
"One he wouldn't need if it weren't for Aiden here."
Ma wrung her hands. "Yes, but suppose someone sees you taking the watch. They might think you a thief." Aiden gave a little pump of his fist.
"That would be amazing. Imagine, Zoe could go to jail. I bet the jail in this town's a lot bigger than Sheriff Callahan's back home."
Ma's eyes grew a little bit wider. "Aiden Kastain, there is nothing exciting about such a thing." Zoe had to agree. There would be nothing good that would come of anyone thinking her a thief.
"We'll just have to make sure that doesn't happen. I'll make sure no one sees me."
Ma opened her mouth, and Zoe figured she was just about to lay down a denial. But Aiden beat her to the punch.
"Don't worry, Zoe. You won't have to steal it."
Zoe narrowed her eyes and hurried to speak before Ma could regain her thought.
"Whatever do you mean?"
Aiden was prevented from replying by a knock on their door. It was Washington, there to fetch them for dinner, and Zoe could only pray that whatever Aiden's plan was, it wouldn't cause too much ruckus. Chapter 7. Downstairs in the dining room, individual tables were set in 3 rows. The matron instructed them to pick any one they liked. They chose an empty one toward the near end of the middle row. Washington held a chair first for Ma and then for Zoe. Aiden didn't even let Wash sit down before he blurted,
"Can I see your watch?"
Zoe bit back her exasperation. Subtle, Aiden was not. Wash eyed Aiden as he tucked his napkin into his lap. "You have to be careful with it. It belonged to my great-grandfather, and I'm hoping I'll be able to get it fixed." Aiden stretched out one hand.
"I'll be real careful with it. I'm right sorry I caused it to get damaged."
He blinked puppy dog eyes in Wash's direction. Zoe turned her chuckle into a fake sneeze. Ma rolled her eyes and then pinned Zoe with a glower that said if Aiden ended up in Sheriff Callahan's jail one of these days, it would be all her fault. Zoe held her breath. This would be the critical moment. If Aiden blurted the wrong thing, he could give away the whole plan. But her little brother, for once in his life, had played his cards perfectly. Wash reached into his pocket and then handed the gold watch and chain to Aiden, who oohed and awed over it as a woman set water glasses by each of their plates.
"This sure is fancy. Look, Zoe, it has a horse and wagon engraved on the front."
Aiden jostled in his seat as he worked his way to his knees so he could lean to show her, and at the same time he swung his free arm wide, knocking Wash's water glass right into his lap. Wash gasped and shot to his feet. Water dripped from his lap, but at least he'd managed to save the glass. He set it on the table with a firm thunk. They all stared for a moment. Zoe's conscience pricked her. Poor Wash. By his expression, he was doing his very best to batten down a whole wagon load of frustration. His jaw bulged in and out. Then he muttered, "Never leave yourself behind." Zoe frowned. Had she heard him right? What did he mean by that? She might have asked, but it was clear he'd been speaking the words to himself, and she didn't feel now was the right time to probe.
"Sorry."
Aiden did a good job of sounding contrite.
"You better go change. Zoe can hold on to your watch until you have someplace dry to put it."
He reached for Zoe's hand and carefully tucked the watch into her palm and then folded her fingers closed over it as if to show Wash how safe the watch now was. With a sigh, Wash turned for the stairs. "I'll be back." They watched him go until they were sure he couldn't see them any longer, and then Zoe and Aiden burst out laughing. Zoe ruffled Aiden's hair. "You are quite the thespian, little brother. Nicely done." She handed the timepiece to Ma and was happy to see that even Ma had a bit of a smile on her face over the whole affair. Wash woke on the morning of Zoe's test, feeling groggy and ill-tempered. Aiden hadn't been expected on the trip, so the Kastains had only reserved a room with 2 beds. But since Wash had an extra one in his room, he'd offered that Aiden could stay the night with him. He wasn't sure what had possessed him to do so, after the imp had soaked him twice in one day. No, that wasn't true at all. He knew exactly what had possessed him. He'd wanted to show kindness to the younger brother of the beautiful soul that was Zoe Kastain. She was like sugared ginger and sunshine and vivid blue skies. Next to her, he felt like vinegar and gray clouds, especially today. Sure, he might not be at a place where he was confident enough in his ability to provide for her that he was ready to start courting, but if he reached out a little, showed more kindness, even when he didn't feel like it, then maybe some of Zoe's vibrancy would make him a better man. He could hope so, anyway. The problem was that once Aiden had been in his room, even after he'd fallen asleep, Wash had feared that if he slept too heavily, he would wake up to find the mischievous Aiden had disappeared and was lost forever in the city, so every whisper of sound had woken him. But thankfully, he'd made it through the night. A good, strong cup of black coffee would go a long way toward righting his outlook. He would also keep his distance from Aiden today. Just staying dry would also improve his mood. Thankfully, they'd decided at dinner the evening before that he would accompany Zoe to her test, while Mrs. Kastain ran some errands about town with Aiden. That meant his attitude had improved already, since most of his day would be spent in a disaster-free zone. Yawning expansively, he reached out and ruffled Aiden's hair. "Wake up, kiddo. We have to get a move on." Aiden was one of those irritating morning people who popped right out of bed and started chattering from the first breath. And by the time Wash knocked on the other door to escort the women down to breakfast, he could hardly wait to get into a carriage alone with Zoe. She chattered sometimes too, but she did know when to hold her tongue, and even if she was in a talkative mood, her stories never seemed to irritate him. Breakfast was a short affair. Zoe, as usual, was chomping at the bit to get to her test early. They made plans to meet back at the train station this evening, and as he and Zoe bid Mrs. Kastain farewell and sank into the taxi that would take them to the Territorial University of Washington, he could tell that Zoe was as nervous as a lone fly in a box full of frogs. They were the only two in the cab. She sat on the bench across from him, rocking a little and studying a few papers in her lap. Her lips moved as she recited things back to herself. With his elbow propped against the side wall of the carriage, he watched her. Glints of sunlight streamed through the cab's window and caught in her hair. For most of the train trip yesterday, she'd left her hair down while it dried, and he'd never before realized how much he loved the color of those red, wavy locks. Today she'd pinned it up, but wisps of curls had slipped out to frame her face, and she kept blowing one out of her eyes as she studied. He took a breath and forced himself to look away. With her creamy skin, a smattering of freckles, and those dark-lashed blue eyes of hers, she was beautiful in a way that drove home his earlier realization of how inadequate he was for taking care of her. He wanted to be in the cavalry. What kind of life was that to offer a woman? He would constantly be traveling and at the beck and call of his commanding officers, hardly ever home, and in danger when he wasn't. He rubbed his palms against his knees. No matter how attractive he found her, or how he might wish to make her his wife, he'd best remember that she deserved a better life than that. Much better. Zoe needed a man who would be steady and constant and make her rethink when she got one of her fancy ideas. He wouldn't be able to do that if he was gone all the time. Yes, it would be best if he didn't allow these feelings to go anywhere. Best for her, and that was really what mattered. The horse's hooves clip-clopped a soothing tattoo against the cobbled street. And despite how the busyness of Seattle had set his teeth on edge yesterday, he had to admit there was a certain melody to the sound of a waking city. Zoe whimpered a little sound, drawing his gaze back to her. The notes in her hand trembled. He leaned forward, propped his elbows against his knees, and laid his hand over the paper, making sure he had eye contact before he said, "Relax. You're going to do just fine." She worked her teeth over her lower lip. "I'm just not certain. I've never gotten top marks in mathematics, and the only one who ever beat you was Ken. There are certain regions of geography that I probably don't know as well as I should, and you always took top marks in geography. I never even started to school until I was 12. What if there are things I don't even know that I don't know? We've spent so much to get me here to take this test. If I fail, I know Ma will still love me, but it'll be such a disappointment to her, and—" "Zoe!" With a chuckle, Wash took both her hands in his. "Take a breath." She did, but gave him a little exasperated roll of her eyes. He squeezed her fingers and rubbed his thumbs over her knuckles. "Last year, you told me something about becoming a teacher. Do you remember?" She blinked at him, blankly. "You told me you felt like God had called you to this, right?" She nodded.
Most definitely, which only adds more pressure. What if I— Zoe? Wash kept his voice low and steady. Yes?
First, this doesn't have to be a one-time and you're out if you fail prospect. If you don't pass, you'll just come back and take it again, because you know this is what you're meant to do. You remember Moses? When God called him to take the children of Israel out of Egypt, God gave him everything he needed to accomplish that task. Same with building the temple. There are verses that talk about the skilled workman. And you are that, Zoe. Definitely skilled at what God has called you to do. You're great with kids and have a knack for explaining things in simple, understandable ways. God won't leave you without the tools you need to do what He's called you to. And you've done your part, right? You've studied and done your very best to prepare for this.
She nodded, and he felt some of the tension leave her hands. She blew at that strand of curls again. He smiled.
Good. Then that's all you can ask of yourself. I think you're going to pass. But if you don't, you'll study some more, and you'll have a better understanding of your areas of weakness. Then you'll come back and take it again.
She still looked uncertain, even if she had relaxed a little. It was time to bring some levity to this. He smiled at her.
I'll be right by your side through it all. But if there is a next time, can we please leave Aiden at home?
Zoe threw back her head on a laugh that tinkled like Christmas bells. Wash grinned. He liked the sound of that. Liked the sound of it a lot more than he should, since he'd just been telling himself he wasn't the right man for her. He released her hands and sat back. Zoe pulled in a long, measured breath and then blew it out slowly. And drat if that action didn't draw his gaze to her lips. He squirmed and fiddled with his Stetson where it rested next to him on the seat. How far was it to their stop anyway? His answer came just then, as the driver of the cab thumped on the roof. Territorial University of Washington to the right. Wash felt relieved as they stepped out and stood on the sidewalk. Distance from the beguiling Miss Zoe Kastain would do him some good about now. Zoe eyed the building as she adjusted her satchel on her shoulder. I can do this. He nodded and stuffed his hands into his pockets so he wouldn't be tempted to reach out and brush that curl from her face.
Yes, you can. I'll be waiting and praying for you.
Her eyes softened. I can't thank you enough for all you've done for me since Pa passed, Wash. Any time I've needed a listening ear, you've been there. It's meant a lot.
I'm happy to be of assistance, Zoe.
More than she knew. More than he ought to be. She gave him a little wave and trotted across the street to disappear into the building. He gripped the lining of his pockets, trying to decide where he should spend the next few hours, and it was only as the emptiness of his pockets registered that he recollected he'd never gotten his watch back from her the evening before. He'd have to remember to do that before he got home. He needed to take the watch apart and see if he could fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 8. Zoe clutched her satchel to her chest as she stepped into the large testing room. Several women and a couple men already sat throughout the area, each at a separate table. A matron in a black dress stood from a desk at the back of the room and strode toward her. Her raven-colored hair was pulled into such a tight bun that it gave her dark eyebrows the appearance of winging upward on the outer edges. Eyes the color of a winter pond glittered without welcome. Zoe swallowed and took a step back. Her heart thudded against her breastbone. The woman pinched her lips together and held out a bony hand. Come, give me your letter of permission. Oh, yes. Zoe fumbled through her satchel to find the letter she'd received granting her a spot in today's testing. She thanked the heavens that she hadn't been holding her satchel when they'd all gone into the creek. What a disaster that would have been. She handed the letter to the matron, who narrowed her eyes and took the longest time to study it, as if she might think Zoe was trying to deceive her. Satchel clutched close once more. Zoe licked her lips. Is everything in order? The woman lowered the letter and handed it back to her. I suppose it is. Name? Zoe, ma'am. The matron rolled her eyes. Full name? A couple of the other test-takers snickered. Zoe felt her face warm. Zoe Kastain. Very well, Zoe Kastain. Please take a seat at an empty table. Testing will begin in 30 minutes. Until then, you will study quietly without talking. Understand? Yes, ma'am. Without another word, the woman returned to her desk. Zoe sank down at one of the empty tables next to a pretty brunette. The girl leaned toward her and whispered, "Don't take her harshness to heart. She spoke to all of us just the same way. I'm Fern." Zoe had never been more thankful for a friendly face. "I'm Zoe." "Silence!" the matron snapped from the back of the room. Fern rolled her eyes and made a little face. And Zoe felt one of the chains of tension inside her snap free, followed by another and another. She took a cleansing breath and closed her eyes. "Father, you called me here, like Wash said. Help me to be calm, to remember everything I've studied, and to think clearly. And if it happens that I pass this test, then I'll be the best teacher I know how to be." She felt much calmer after that. And when, 30 minutes later, the matron set the test before her, she picked up her pen and set to work without even a tremor in her hand. Susan stood outside the jeweler's store with Aiden's hand clasped tightly. He'd been antsy all morning, and the last thing she wanted was for him to run off when she was alone with him. The boy could move faster than a striking rattler. One moment he would be by her side, and in the next instant he could be out of sight. She didn't need that kind of stress today. But that wasn't the reason for her hesitation outside the shop. No, not at all. She took a breath and blew it out slowly. The truth was, last night, Mr. Harrow had unnerved her in a very appealing way. She had never been one who'd given stock to stories of people falling in love at first sight. After all, she and William had been friends from the time they were young people and hadn't fallen in love until years down the road. So yes, indeed, it had been disturbing to have her heart go all aflutter at her first glimpse of the man, a total stranger, the evening before. He was handsome, maybe more than some, but certainly she'd been around handsome men before and had never felt like a schoolgirl with her first infatuation. Something about him had settled soul deep before he'd even said 2 words last evening. Maybe it was his fathomless eyes that had seemed to carry such profound peace and yet sorrow at the same time. Understanding had hit her the moment he'd revealed that his wife had passed away. Of course, that would be a point of connection. Yet there had been more. And it was the more that terrified her. "You okay, Ma?" Aiden jostled her hand. She gave herself a little shake. "Yes, dear." Whatever had attracted her to the man so viscerally could only be fleeting and needed to be pushed aside. She and her children would be going back to Wyldhaven tonight, and she'd likely never see him again. Between now and then, she only had to have a conversation with him and not stumble all over herself. She could do that, right? "Ma!" Aiden sighed. "Are we going inside?" "Yes, we are." She pushed the door open, and a bell jangled above her head as she stepped inside. And there he was, bent over the counter, working on a small clock. He glanced up. His eyes widened a little, and he leapt to his feet, snatching his spectacles from his face. He smiled. "Hello." Though she could tell he meant the greeting for both of them, his gaze never left hers as he said it. "Hello." The word emerged on a bit of a squeak. Feeling her face heat, she swallowed and tore her gaze from those deep pools of chocolatey caramel. All around the walls, every space was filled with different styles of clocks. Some were small and round. Others were long and rectangular with little figures at the top and pendulums tick-tick-ticking. The minute hands on each clock clicked over to the quarter hour, and suddenly the whole room was filled with a beautiful cacophony of chimes and cuckoos. "Wow!" Aiden exclaimed loudly, covering his ears with his palms. "This is great!" It wasn't long before the noise receded, and Susan swept a little motion with her hand. "You have a lovely store." Aiden darted over to a large clock that stood taller than her head. "Don't touch it, Aiden." Shoulders drooping, he glanced over his shoulder.
"Yes, Ma."
"Where do your hands go?" Susan prompted. With a sigh, Aiden clasped his hands behind his back and glanced at her for permission to proceed. She nodded. "Thank you. You may look but not touch while I have a conversation with Mr. Harrow."
"Yes, Ma."
As she turned to face the counter, Mr. Harrow smiled softly. "Good to see you again." His eyes held a softness that revealed the depth of his meaning. She remained where she stood, feet seemingly rooted to the floor. Could it be that the man was feeling some of the same things she was? And why was she, at her age, so flustered? She didn't know the first thing about this man. He might not even be a believer. His lips tilted up almost imperceptibly, and his voice lowered when he said, "You can approach the counter, and I promise I won't bite." Susan felt her face heat. "Ah." She jolted into action, fumbling through her reticule for Washington's watch. "I have the timepiece here." She stepped closer, laid it on the counter, and then snatched her hand back to her side. His gaze held hers as he reached for the watch, and that imperceptible smile was suddenly very perceptible. "Do you just have 2 children?" He lowered his gaze to the watch and assessed it, pressing the spring to open the cover. "No, I have 5. She was relieved to say so. Perhaps that reminder would return her feet to solid ground. No man would want to take on a woman with 5 children in tow. As he laid a pocket watch on the counter, he lifted his gaze to hers. His brows arched. 5? I'm sure that keeps you busy." She focused on the clocks on the wall behind him. "You have no idea." He opened his mouth as though ready to speak, but then snapped it shut again. He worked for a moment with the watch, and soon the face of it lay beside the casing. "Well, the 2 of your children that I have met have both been very charming." Susan tossed a glance toward Aiden. Seeing that he was still fascinated by a cuckoo clock next to the door and not touching it, she returned her attention to Mr. Harrow. "Thank you. Zoe's my second-born. She has an older sister named Belle, and then between Zoe and Aiden are twins, Sharon Rose and Shiloh." Mr. Harrow worked at a tiny screw as he tossed a glance toward Aiden. He raised his voice. "The only man among women, are you, son?" Aiden gave an exaggerated sigh.
"Yes, sir."
The man smiled. He flipped her a glance before returning his focus to the watch. "I grew up in a large family myself. I always wanted to have several children, but that never happened." He stated the words matter-of-factly, and Susan found herself wondering what the reason was. Had his wife been unable to conceive, or had she not wanted children? Either way, he must be very lonely. She couldn't imagine what her life would have been like after William's passing if she hadn't had the children to distract her from her grief. She stepped closer to the counter. "I'm sorry you've been alone." He lifted one shoulder. "My work has kept me busy. The shop has definitely prospered in the last few months." Susan tilted her head. She had a feeling that what he was actually saying was that he had thrown all of his grief into nonstop work, which had made the shop prosper. "I can't imagine what I would have done if I didn't have the children." "It has definitely been the most difficult time of my life." "When did your wife pass?" Susan felt her face heat. "I'm sorry, it's none of my business." She fiddled with the strings of her purse. "No, it's fine. Cassie passed away a week before last Christmas." "William left us at the end of March, but he had been sick for a long time before that. He was shot by an outlaw and never quite recovered. But in many ways, that time helped prepare me for life without him, because he was incapacitated for much of it." Behind her, the bell above the door jangled. She turned to see who had entered, but no one was there. "Aiden?" Her eyes darted around the store. He wasn't here. She dashed to the door and burst onto the sidewalk, looking both directions. She caught a glimpse of him turning a corner into an alley. "Aiden, stop!" As she charged after him, she heard Mr. Harrow calling for her to wait, but he didn't know Aiden like she did. The boy would run until he was exhausted, and then he would be lost. She had to keep him in sight. He must have been upset by her mention of William's death. Careless. Why hadn't she thought? Skirts raised enough to allow her to run, she turned the corner. Oh, thank heavens. Aiden was just ahead, back against the bricks of the store, and one foot propped up behind him. He studied his hands, fiddling with his fingers. Susan stopped by his side and took a couple of breaths. He glanced up at her, then back down at his hands.
Sorry, I shouldn't have run.
Susan couldn't reprimand him. She only reached out and hugged him close as she pulled in a few more gulps of oxygen. As much as she had grieved for William, she couldn't imagine what it must be like to have been a 7-year-old, now 8, trying to process a father's passing. Footsteps approached, and she turned to see Mr. Harrow cautiously drawing near. Heavens, what was the man going to think? But there was no censure in his expression. Instead, he looked contrite. He squatted to Aiden's level. "I'm right sorry we upset you." Aiden only sniffed. Balanced on the balls of his feet, Mr. Harrow rubbed his fingers along his jaw. "Was your pa a God-fearing man?" Aiden nodded.
He made us go to church every Sunday and licked us good if we misbehaved during service.
Susan chuckled at Aiden's interpretation. The truth was, William had let Aiden get away with a good many shenanigans during services. But the time he'd brought a toad to church and dropped it down David Hines' shirt, he had received his just reward for that. Mr. Harrow interlaced his fingers before him. "You know what the good book says, right?" Susan's pulse quickened. So the man was a believer. Aiden pushed back from her, swiping at his cheeks.
What?
"It says that if a man believes in Jesus, that the moment he leaves this earth, he's in the presence of his Lord." Aiden pondered for a moment.
And there's no pain in heaven, right?
Mr. Harrow nodded and stood. "The Bible says that, too." After another moment's pause, Aiden tucked his hand into hers.
We can go back to the store now.
As they turned to do that, Susan smiled her gratitude to Mr. Harrow. He gave a swipe of one hand as if to say it was nothing. They had just started back down the alley when from behind them there came a whine. They all three turned. At the back end of the alley, there was a door that must be the rear entrance to a business. It had a set of rickety steps leading up to it, and a black and white dog lay partially beneath them. Upon seeing that they'd stopped, it lowered its head and scooted toward them on its belly, inching out far enough that they could see its tail wagging. Aiden gasped.
Ma! It's the dog from the train station!
He rushed toward it. Susan hurried after him, warning bells clanging caution in her mind. Something wasn't right.
Oh, Ma, it's hurt!
Aiden fell to his knees by the dog. He started to reach out to pet it, but the dog growled low in its throat.
It's okay,
Aiden crooned.
I won't hurt you.
He reached for the dog again. Aiden, don't. But this time, when his hand settled on the animal's head, it made no sound. It rested its muzzle on its paws, and its tail thumped a beat against the dirt of the alley. Aiden looked up, eyes pleading.
We can't just leave it here. Look, something happened to its leg.
Susan bent to see. Sure enough, the dog had been in a fight of some kind. Its back leg and part of its front shoulder were matted with blood. Susan pushed out a breath of despair. There really wasn't anything she could do for the dog, not when they had to be back to the train in a few hours. Aiden, we'll bring the dog back to my store. Mr. Harrow spoke over her. She looked at him. He nodded. I know you're leaving again in a few days, but you can come back to see it tomorrow and tonight. She shouldn't have interrupted, but she didn't want him to misunderstand. We go back to our home tonight. There was the barest hint of a twitch near one of his eyes.
I see. Well?
He looked down at the dog.
That doesn't change the fact that I can take care of the dog.
At that moment, another higher-pitched whine drew their attention to the space beneath the stairs.
"Oh, Ma! Look!"
Aiden exclaimed. Before Susan could think to caution him, Aiden had scrambled beneath the stairs. He emerged with 2 skin-and-bones puppies clutched to his chest. The puppies wriggled and wagged their tails. They appeared to be about 6 weeks old. One was pure white, with 1 black ear and 2 black paws. The other was spotted like the mother. Susan pressed a hand to her chest. Oh, these poor creatures. Even worse, she had a feeling that the bone they'd given the dog the day before might be responsible for its injury. Some other hungry dog must have come and fought her for it. Mr. Harrow sighed.
They can come too.
"Ma, we can take the puppies, can't we?"
Aiden's eyes pleaded.
"They can go in a box when we're on the train. I'll watch them, I promise."
Wide-eyed, Susan looked to Mr. Harrow. He raised one shoulder.
They do look old enough to be parted from their mother. I can keep one, but not all 3.
Susan looked back at the puppies. They already had Jinx at home and couldn't take another dog, but they could keep them until they found good homes for them. She gave Aiden a firm look. "We can't keep the puppies, understand? If we take them back to Wyldhaven, we can only care for them until we find someone else who wants them." Aiden grinned from ear to ear.
"Okay, I'll find homes that are close so I can go visit them real often."
Susan chuckled. "That'll be fine." Mr. Harrow cleared his throat.
"And maybe you'll let me write to you?"
Susan's gaze flew to his. He motioned from the dog to Aiden.
"You know, so I can let the boy know how the dog is faring."
There was such an innocent, hopeful look in his eyes that Susan couldn't prevent a smile. "Well, if it's only to tell us about the dog, I suppose that wouldn't be improper." Mr. Harrow grinned.
"I'll keep my letters on topic, you can be sure."
His warm gaze remained fixed on her face, and he lowered one eye in a quick wink. Susan felt her face heat. Oh, heavens! Who would have thought that she might need a fan during the heart of a Seattle winter? Chapter 9. Zoe blew out a noisy sigh and folded the test booklet closed. She'd looked over all her answers multiple times and felt confident that she'd answered every question to the best of her ability. She glanced around the room. She hadn't realized that she was the last one working. The matron's lips were pinched even tighter than normal as Zoe approached her desk.
"Wondered if you were going to complete it before your time was up." "Oh, I've been done for a while, but was just checking over my answers."
The woman sniffed.
"If you were confident of the answers the first time you put them down, you wouldn't have needed to do that."
Zoe blinked. What must it be like to be such a sourpuss all the time? Maybe the woman had been through a great tragedy, or maybe several great tragedies, but Zoe didn't figure it was her place to pry.
"When can I expect to hear back?"
"We'll mail you." "Yes, ma'am." Zoe clung to every last ounce of politeness she could muster.
"Do you know when that will be?"
The woman sighed and gave a little roll of her dark eyes.
"In a few weeks."
Zoe supposed that was all the information she was going to get.
"All right. Thank you for taking time to proctor the test."
"Doctor the test? Are you asking me to change your answer?"
"No, ma'am. Proctor the test. You know, sit here and keep an eye on all of us."
"Oh." The woman's brow slumped. "None of the others thanked me. Are you trying to score higher marks than you deserve by buttering me up?"
Zoe sighed. "No, ma'am. Have a nice day."
She turned and walked away before her penchant to blurt her feelings had her saying something she really would regret. Wash and his smile were such a welcome sight when she left the building that she couldn't resist throwing her arms around his neck for a quick hug. He smiled and set her back from him.
"What was that for?"
"For simply being my friend and the kind one that you are."
Wash glanced back toward the building as they walked away.
Test that difficult?
Zoe wobbled her head. I'm fairly certain that I knew most of the answers. The essays will be telling. Did I remember to write down everything I knew about mollusks? I simply can't recall what I even wrote right now. My brain feels like a bowl of Ewan's hot chili. Wash frowned.
That bad, huh?
Exhaustion hit her in a wave, and she looped her arm through his. Just get me back to the boarding house so we can gather our bags. Wash lifted one hand to hail a taxi. What did you do with yourself all day? He shrugged.
It was sunny for this time of year, even if not very warm, but I was bundled up. I walked down to the water and then ate lunch at a little diner. You hungry?
Zoe suddenly realized she was. Starvin'. He pulled a paper-wrapped sandwich and an apple from his coat pocket.
I thought you might be. Brought these for you.
Heavenly. Zoe munched quietly, and when they got back to the boarding house, Wash asked the taxi to wait while he ran up to get their bags. Ma and Aiden would have already left for the station. Zoe felt a zip of excitement shoot through her exhausted body. Had Ma been able to get the watch fixed? She certainly hoped so. She couldn't wait to see the look on Wash's face when she gave it to him. Wash returned within a few minutes, and not long after, they settled onto the bench in train car number 9 across from Ma and Aiden. Zoe and Wash gasped and fawned over the puppies and laughed at Ma's story of how Mr. Harrow had gotten soaking wet while giving the mama and her 2 pups a bath.
And the mama dog wasn't hurt near as bad as we first thought, Aiden exclaimed. When we left, she was sniffing around Mr. Harrow's clock shop, and Mr. Harrow's going to write to me so I can know how she's doing.
Ma fidgeted and blushed. Zoe narrowed her eyes. Is he now? Seeing that Wash was distracted with one of the puppies, Zoe leaned close to Ma.
Was he able to fix it?
Ma nodded and surreptitiously slipped the fob from her reticule. She pressed it into Zoe's hand. Then she stood. Aiden, how about we go down to the dining car and see if we can buy the puppies some milk? Zoe appreciated the fact that she was giving her some space to give him the watch in a little privacy.
That's a great idea!
Aiden lurched to his feet and trailed after her, but he dashed back only a moment later.
You two will watch the puppies while I'm gone, won't you?
Zoe chuckled. Yes, Aiden, we will. Wash leaned forward and returned the white pup with the black ear to the box with the other one. He rested his elbows against his knees, and they watched the puppies in silence for a moment. Both curled into a tangled heap and seemed to be settling in for a nap. Perfect. Zoe cleared her throat. Wash?
Yeah?
He yawned and scrubbed his hands over his face, and then looked at her, and the impact of his gray-green eyes suddenly had Zoe at a loss for words. He frowned and straightened.
You all right?
Swallowing, she held the watch out in an open palm.
Oh.
He reached for it.
I've been meaning to ask you for that back.
Open it. His brow furrowed, but he followed her instructions. The moment the cover sprung open, a soft ticking sound could be heard. His eyes widened and lifted to hers. She smiled. Mr. Harrow is a watchmaker. He was able to fix it. That was Ma's errand that she had to run today. Wash cleared his throat and looked back at the timepiece. Then his eyes narrowed a little.
Wait a minute. Are you the reason I got a glass of water in my lap at dinner last night?
Before she could stop it, a chuckle burst free. Aiden should be in theater, right? She held up a hand. In my defense, I did not know his plan was to soak you for the second time that day. The gold fob looked small in Wash's big hand as he studied it. He swallowed.
Zoe, I know you can't afford...
She laid a hand on his arm. It didn't cost so much as you might think. I have a feeling Mr. Harrow gave me a rock-bottom price, but I was thrilled he could fix it for you. I know how much it meant when your pa gave it to you. Aiden even pitched in the money Belle gave him to spend on candy for the trip. She smiled. Happy Christmas, Washington. His throat worked, and if she wasn't missing her guess, that was a sheen of moisture in his eyes. His hand settled warmly over hers.
Happy Christmas, Zoe.
This has been an unabridged production of Washington Nolan's Christmas Watch by Lynnette Bonner. Copyright 2019 by Lynnette Bonner. Read by Amy Lilly, directed and engineered by Adam Hassel at the Oasis Audio Studios. If you've enjoyed this audio production, please look for Parson Clay's Christmas Pup, Story 10 in the Wyldhaven series. It can be found on Amazon, iTunes, and Audible.